We don't usually do long segments about our holidays on Novara Media, but as many of you will know, I've recently come back from 2 weeks in China, and given me and Aaron love talking about the country so much, I thought it would be worth sharing some of my thoughts here on the show. Of course, going to China, seeing some new buildings, some bright LED lights, and coming back with your mind blown by cool infrastructure is not exactly original. Lots of people are doing it at the moment. And it's something actually that the Chinese government seem keen for Westerners to do. So hyper-modern cities like Chongqing, a city of around 18 million people in central China, often forms the backdrop of videos extolling the wondrous virtues of modern China. My Twitter feed is currently full of short videos showing the drone show in Chongqing, which the city put on for their May Day bank holiday. Unfortunately, I wasn't there for this. I missed this. I'm yet to see a drone show, which I would love to do. Some influencers have been explicit about the message we're supposed to take away from the impressive skylines of China.
This is a warning to any Westerner visiting China. The first thing that's going to happen is you're going to question your reality of living in the States or living in the West. As in, what the hell are we getting in the West? As an American born and raised my whole entire life, I could not imagine living in a city that looks as beautiful as this. This is Shanghai. And here in Shanghai, I could leave my bags right here, unattended, probably for the whole day. It would still be there, or the police would probably pick it up for me, right? You could not do that probably anywhere in America.
It's worth being clear from the outset, the China maxing phenomenon seems partly manufactured. The Chinese government has been courting influencers to improve its image in the West. Indeed, they even invited me on an all-expenses-paid trip to the country last year. I suppose reluctantly, but also politely turned that down and went this year off my own back instead. Now, you might notice my phone camera isn't as good as some of the influencers online. I didn't take a gimbal or even a selfie stick, but I still thought I'd share some moments I thought would be interesting for you guys to see, and which would spark some interesting conversations with Aaron and myself. And I did go, for my sins, to some classic influencer haunts. This is the restaurant in Chongqing where you can cook your own meat barbecue as you look at the lit up Chongqing skyline. Covering your skyscrapers with LED lights really does create quite the impression. I do believe they go off at 10:30, so everyone can sleep. You're not sort of stuck with that in your city all throughout the night. This is my friend Lewis doing the Western Tourist Chongqing barbecue pose. This is the view as you ride the monorail. So it's the train that goes through the apartment block, which has become the iconic image of Chongqing. And I mean, one thing that just stands out to you is the density of Chongqing and all of these cities. Makes me even more of a YIMBY than I already am. Sort of most of these buildings would probably get blocked in London because they'd say this is not within the character of the local area. So it's nice to go somewhere where they're not afraid of density. That's some of my terrible camera work. Then you can find better portrayals of Chongqing's architecture elsewhere on YouTube, people with drones, people who are really sort of committed to the bit of sort of filming fancy buildings from high locations. What I thought I could probably add, though, here is how the local government is very actively using this infrastructure to build legitimacy in public relations campaigns. So these are all posters from a metro station in Chongqing put up by the city-owned rail network. Here you can see a photo of the monorail. The text in Chinese says, "Promote high-quality development, create high-quality life," which is pretty much my politics in a sentence. This one has the image of the monorail going into the apartment building that's sort of iconic now. It says, "Speed up and run, move forward." And then this one says, "Accelerating the construction of a metropolitan area on rails." I want to take a pause here. Aaron, you don't see many posters like that on the London Underground. They're normally telling you, not to look at people funny or to do sexual harassment or not littering. Whereas in China, you've got this sort of constant vision of, the future is bright. We're building infrastructure so you can have a brilliant life.
Yeah. Well, it's because we're not a country anymore, Michael. We're a Ponzi scheme. This country is a Ponzi scheme. It doesn't have a vision of the future. It doesn't have a sense of collectivity and meaning like many other places do. And those kinds of messages that you saw on those posters were exactly what you'd see on British rail posters, basically from 1945.
That's kind of true, actually.
And before then as well, but basically from 1945 all the way through to privatization. And if you don't believe me, put in retro British rail poster and you'll see a ton of stuff that's just really optimistic and bold about the country. and about what we're going to build together and how it was better than yesterday and better than today. And we should be optimistic about what's ahead of us. That's gone because we aren't a country. And people might think I'm being flippant when I say this, but we are not. We're an economic zone. We're a Ponzi scheme. We're a market for US capital and big tech. We're a place where US asset managers can exploit us. We're a place where US big tech can open servers and can actually hire pretty cheap, efficient, effective labor when it comes to their industry. We're a nice little entrepot for US finance and for global finance, which is effectively a US industry. We're an aircraft carrier in terms of US bases being in the North Atlantic. We have many US bases in this country. So Britain is not a country anymore, sadly. And I say that with sadness because I'd like it to be. When I go to places like Birmingham, when I go to places like Wales, I am so excited about what I see. I think the country has enormous potential. I think its past is extraordinary. I think its people are amazing. I think even though it's a small country of 68 million people, there's an enormous amount of variety. But our political and media elites don't want us to be a country because it's not how they maintain their wealth. We're a Ponzi scheme. So that's why you can't have these kinds of displays of what are frankly propaganda. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. They are propaganda, right? They're telling you what to feel about something. Instead, we have an empire of the mundane and the malicious. Like you say, don't harass people. If you see anything, contact British Transport Police. But of course, the funny thing is, Michael, British Transport Police don't exist. They're being cut, right? There are no BTP. You know this, I know this. They barely exist. I know people that work on the trains in this country. The entire train carriage is smashed up. They can do nothing. I talk to people in the TSA, the RMT, ASLEF. There is no BTP, but don't forget, 3 times on one journey, 10 minutes, see it, say it, sorted, contact BTP. We've replaced the reality of the BTP with a simulacrum, a mirage. And this is basically the post-1979 British state. It's not real. There's nothing really substantial to it. So how could it forge a distinctive, interesting, vibrant idea of the future? China can do that. To some extent, I think France does that. To some extent, I think Spain does that. Britain certainly doesn't. Hasn't for a long time. And it's something, I'm in politics. I helped start Novara Media. I want to change that. But I think that's a really sharp distinction between our culture today and what we're seeing in places like China.
Yeah, and people do sort of poo-poo the China maxing thing because they say, these people looking at these shiny buildings, actually there is oppression, yada, yada, yada. Now, obviously, the shiny buildings and the great infrastructure doesn't make a country perfect. But if you are seeking legitimacy through fantastic infrastructure, there are many worse ways one can seek legitimacy. One can seek legitimacy by talking about how your neighbors are evil or talking about how you're a brilliant ethnic group and you have to defeat outsiders. If the source of your legitimacy is like actively and explicitly, we can build brilliant fast trains, I think that's one of the better forms of propaganda a state can have. I want to move on to the next city I went to because I suppose images of impressive infrastructure I knew I was going to see because I'd already seen it online, right? Everyone knows that China can build stuff. So one of my concerns is the wrong way to put it, but sort of something I was really looking for is sort of joy. Now, obviously, it would be ridiculous to sort of say, the 1.4 billion people are having a good time. But when I see sort of major fast development, my worry is sort of there isn't time for people to sort of just relax and have a good time if it's a very hyper-competitive society. And that meant that Chengdu, I suppose to sort of put to bed some of those fears, is a brilliant place to visit. Now, Chengdu is the capital of Sichuan province. It is a couple of hours of train, a couple of hours by train from Chongqing. Another mega city, so it has around 20 million people, known as China's most relaxed city, which definitely seemed true to me. So it's full of relaxed streetscapes, cafes by rivers, people eating hot pot, having beers out in the street. It felt surprisingly like being in Barcelona or Berlin. Aaron asked me yesterday what I found most surprising about China. I said, 1, it's a bit more communist than I thought, which is what we're going to get onto. And 2, it felt more like a European city at times than I had thought. It didn't feel sort of that different. Walking around on hot evening felt like, in Chengdu in particular, felt like you're in Barcelona or Berlin. People having just a really nice time. Obviously not everyone, but lots of people. And my big takeaway from Chengdu, this is what sort of surprised me not about China, but about sort of like my overall philosophy in general, is that major roads apparently don't have to be miserable places. Now, this is, of course, mainly made possible in China because nearly everyone drives an electric car. So you don't have all the noise and pollution that you would sort of with petrol-powered engines. But it's also because in Chengdu, they very creatively covered all their major roads with climbing vines and flowers. I think we can get up a picture here. How lovely is that? You also have silent cars again. So you can see there you've got a Chinese electric vehicle with all of those vines going up those concrete motorways. Now, I'd never imagined a concrete motorway could be beautiful. And when you walk around at night under those motorways, they're actually quite pro-social places. So here you have people having beers and a barbecue under a pretty major road junction. And this was perhaps my favorite thing I saw on my whole trip. It's a musical gathering by retired people under a Chengdu motorway junction. Now, I love that. Now, because I was thinking, when I got invited by the Chinese government to go on the influencer tour, it's very attractive because it's all expenses paid, etc. But I was worried that anything I saw, I would feel like, oh, I'm just being shown this because it's a state-backed influencer tour. That literally, I just wandered past it in the street. And it's like just loads and loads of old people who gather on a weekend under a motorway to all sing to each other. Like it were quite organized performances. So you had different people go up, playing different musical instruments, singing songs. There was a guy, the video is a little bit abrupt because, I felt like, is it appropriate to be filming this? And there was a guy who was, he was an older fella, but I couldn't work out if it was a police uniform or whatever, but he sort of wandered up to me and I thought he was going to say, this isn't for you to film, etc. But he said, come sit down. And then he sung the next song. So he really wanted us to come and see him sing his song. I should also say, going back to the car issue, Chengdu, Chongqing, every city I visited, so I went to Beijing, Chengdu, Chongqing, Shanghai, have a brilliant metro system. So I'm not saying let's not bother with public transport. Let's just have mega roads all across the city. Chengdu especially, they all live in mega blocks. So you have lots of car-free spaces sort of in the courtyards, in between the office buildings. But yeah, it did... Sort of being in Shanghai where most of the cars, I think all the cars actually seem to be electric. I think maybe they've got more regulation. In Chengdu, it felt more like 80%. But it does really change sort of the urban environment, sort of not having petrol cars everywhere. And I feel warmer to cars than I once did. I wonder what you think about that, Aaron.
Well, the sound of electric vehicles is almost quite soothing, isn't it? It's like a bit like water, just gone past me. Wow, it's like the wind. The images you had up a minute ago from Chengdu with the vines, the clematis and the creepers on the road infrastructure could never happen in Britain, right? Why? Because Serco Capita G4S would say, sorry, mate, 100 grand to plant the creeper. But what are you talking about? It's a creeper. It's literally a problem. They grow so quickly and so much. It's literally a problem. What do you mean 100 grand? Sorry, £100,000 and then £20,000 a year maintenance costs. Now, if you think I'm joking, would you categorize Britain as a country, Michael, with lots of trees?
Yes.
Yeah, lots of trees, right? Lots of trees. Great climate for trees. Where I live, Colas charge Portsmouth City Council £5,000 to plant a tree. £5,000. Now, you might say, well, they've got to put the protective, guard around it, and they've got to make sure that it's a healthy tree, and then they'll make all kinds of arguments, but that's the fundamental reality. £100,000, by the way, for a zebra crossing. £100,000. China can do a ton of that stuff because they don't have rent-seeking at the heart of how they do public services with things like PFI, outsourcing, and whatnot. So it looks great. We should do it, but we cannot do it with the setup we presently have. By the way, that contract we have with Colas in Portsmouth, 25-year contract. Right? What muggins signed that? I don't know. I think it was a Liberal Democrat. But the idea that, Aaron, that sounds terrible. Let's get out of it. Many local authorities are tied into these contracts for another 5, 10, 15 years. The point is, if that's an authority where you live, when it's up for renewal, my God, make sure you get out of it say we want to bring as much of this stuff in-house as possible. They'll say, well, no, it's not about value for taxpayers' money. If you want creepers and you want vines on your roads and your dual carriageways and your overpasses and your underpasses, this is what you need to do. It needs to be in-house. Otherwise, you have these parasitic companies. In the case of Colas, it's not even based in the UK, it's a French company, absolutely screwing you. So it looks great, let's do it. It would require a political break with the consensus on public service in this country.
Let's get on to one of mine and Aaron's favourite topics to debate on this show, which is the extent to which China is meaningfully communist. I mean, as I said a moment ago, I came away feeling a bit more like I'd been in a communist country than I had expected I would. So in Shanghai, we went to the Chaoyang model village. It was built in the 1950s for industrial workers moving from the countryside. And just around the corner from that, you have a very hipster-looking, now, I suppose, guess what that building is, Aaron?
Community centre?
Local Communist Party headquarters.
Wow.
They had a hipster coffee shop on the ground floor. You could read books by Xi Jinping. I think we can see this, the quite sort of hipster shelves there. And this was the help desk. It was unmanned at that point, which I thought was quite felt-coded. They had a sort of the nicest coffee brand on the ground floor, which is called Manners, which is sort of like nicer than Pret. So it was very fully automated luxury communism. Probably more meaningful, though, were these buildings. So this is a community canteen run by the party. They have them sort of in cities everywhere, loads in Shanghai, and they're specifically designed for elderly people to get cheap meals and to get out of the house. Young people can go, though, as well. We did. The meal was delicious, cost about £2. Can you imagine a more balanced meal for £2? And it was completely heaving. I saw a sort of article online saying they were shutting because of not enough demand, but all the ones we went into were heaving. And I don't have an image of it, actually, because, I didn't want to film sort of in private. But there was one of these sort of Communist Party community centres, which was sort of one of my most sort of meaningful moments there, which was downstairs. They had the canteen, which was closed at that time just because it wasn't the right time of day. But I wandered upstairs mainly because I wanted to use a toilet. And there was a creche, which was empty at that point in time, I think because it was early afternoon. Maybe people were in school. But then there were these two rooms full of elderly people. So one of them were sort of these people playing this sort of interesting wind instrument that I hadn't seen before, but sort of all in a circle playing this wind instrument. And then another one was a dude, an older fella, sort of playing a saxophone with older people all around him, sort of singing along. And I was like, this is how I want to grow old, right? It's just like singing songs in an afternoon, in a local community center where they have like a lovely canteen downstairs and then a creche next door. It's like very, very cool. Also, I hadn't realized, so we spoke to someone sort of towards the end of the trip, sort of saying how brilliant this was. And he said that this is a really new thing. So this was the Xi Jinping thing. So Xi Jinping thought, we're not communist enough. Let's bring in these sort of community canteens. I suppose partly because there was a need there, but also because, he wanted the party to be more in people's lives. So you have more of these community centers opening up, which are sort of quite Communist Party branded, and then have various functions in the community. On the Xi Jinping sort of let's make the country more communist, there's also a lot of that sort of in the more formal sense, communist and nationalist myth-making. So in Shanghai, we went to a very new building. Well, the building wasn't new, but the museum seemed sort of done up recently, commemorating the resistance to the Japanese in the Second World War. In Shanghai, they've also opened a massive museum celebrating the founding of the Communist Party. That was in 1921. So it celebrates 100 years of the party, goes from revolutionary struggle to China's technological flourishing. And there's also a lot of space devoted to Xi Jinping and some quite fun communist escalators. The museum was opened in 2021 for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP. And it seems like in regions across the country, they were sort of doing events to celebrate this. So in Chongqing, they commemorated that anniversary by launching a pretty spectacular Broadway-type show, which we went to. This is our picture by my friend, of Chongqing 1949. So it portrays the communists liberating Chongqing from the KMT, so the nationalists during the Chinese Civil War. If you squint there, you can see that above those lights, there's lots of people sort of flying across the ceiling, which is whenever they were representing sort of fighting. They had people marching through the air. The seats span. It was all very, very high tech. Obviously, though, in many ways, China doesn't feel very communist. So to get to the Communist Party Museum in Shanghai, which I just showed you, you get off at a station called site of the CCP First Founding Conference. It's a very good name for a metro station. But this is what greets you when you walk out of that station. So you can see here, that's site of the first CPC National Congress, South Hangwo Road. And then you sort of turn around, you see a Chanel shop there. Then you get the Apple shop, which is very prominent on a street corner. It's really built up sort of Oxford Street type area. And then you get Tiffany's and Co. Just a bit further down, you had Victoria's Secret, sort of all the major consumer brands in the world and lots of quite well-to-do people sort of around shopping. I suppose, Aaron, I'm not going to be the first person to sort of comment on the coexistence of capitalist consumerism and sort of communist imagery, and also sort of, the conversation I was having with the people I went with was to what extent those community centres were a communist thing or would have just been sort of in any reasonable social democratic country as well. But I suppose, we're often talking about whether or not China is communist. What do you think of my discoveries on my holiday?
Well, the things you're observing with regards to the subsidized canteens, etc., they're in many countries, right? You go to Malta, you've got the Labour Party in every town, basically. You can get nice cheap beer and you can get chips and so on. That's a party cafe or a party restaurant, party bocce, like boule. So that's not unique. You get something similar in Poland. Of course, it's a bit of a hangover from, not a bit of a hangover, it is a hangover from before 1989 of subsidized kind of canteens. You get that in many places. That's not unique to China, although I think the shine on that was particularly impressive, Michael, I must say. Do I think China is a communist country? No. It's a Marxist state ruled by a communist party with a market system. It has markets. China has markets. It has market actors. It has a very successful one integrated into the global economy. But it's a unique model because those market actors often are wholly owned or partly owned by the state or a local authority, a municipality. You have a parallel structure with local governments, but also within businesses, which is party political, CCP. You have party cells within businesses, I think, of more than 9 employees. When you have, city governance, you have the leader of the city, but you also have the leader of the local Communist Party. So yes, it's a market system. It is not a command economy in the way that, George Orwell talks about in Animal Farm. By the way, you're kind of stupid if that's your way of conceiving capitalism and communism. It's literally from a children's book, partly funded by the CIA. It's quite different to that. It's a market system. And then, of course, some people say, well, it's state capitalist. I don't think it's state capitalist, actually. That has a very particular meaning. I think it's somewhat different. I think fundamentally, China, post-Deng Xiaoping, fundamentally pursues the same economic policies that the USSR does with Bukharin and the NEP in the 1920s. There's a big difference there, Michael, and I think people really forget this. People say, well, hold on. Yeah, the USSR was doing interesting things with the NEP, and they threw it all away. Not really. I think Dominic Lacerdo, an Italian philosopher, historian, amazing guy who's now dead, he said that basically Europe had a second 30 Years' War between 1914 and 1945. And Stalin was very aware of this. And the reason why after 1937 you have a ton of purges, you have huge centralization in the economy, is to prepare for the inevitable war with the Third Reich. China hasn't got that problem, right? Because China's in a much more peaceful neighborhood. It's much bigger. It's just huge by the standards of East Asia, whereas Russia was comparatively very underdeveloped compared to countries like Germany in the early 20th century. So it didn't have to necessarily build a war economy to defend itself. When it won, when the communists won by the end of the 1940s, it could develop its own economic model. There were mistakes, there were successes, but it was a sovereign country that could embark on its own future. That wasn't really true of the USSR in the 1930s. So I think when you look at China, it's a path that wasn't followed by the Soviets, after the late 1920s. You can say that was inevitable because of the threat of the Third Reich and the imperialist European colonial powers. Or you can say it was a choice by Stalin. That's what Trotskyists say. But regardless, I think this is very much in keeping with what a coherent Marxist would say you need to do in developing a worker state.
Yeah, I mean, what I find very interesting about China, I suppose, is sort of interesting in terms of anyone's relationship to ideology, is that, yes, the Communist Party of China do seem to believe that they are communist. I mean, Deng's line was let some people get rich first. So Deng Xiaoping, of course, sort of the Chinese leader who did reform an opening. The reason China is rich is basically because of Deng Xiaoping. That's still not disproved. Like, obviously there is massive inequality in China, but maybe they are just letting some people get rich first, and then the party is going to sort of step in and say, well, now's the time for equality. Could be the case. I mean, some people might think that's a bit naive, but it's not disproven. But I suppose
they have also eliminated rural poverty, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I suppose what I am resistant to is when sort of people look at China and see it as confirmation that what they understand as communism works. Because if you look at China, there are lots of things which the Western left would, be out on the streets condemning and opposing. The repression of trade unions, the lack of free speech. Obviously, it's not a liberal democracy. Allowing massive inequality to develop, giving quite a lot of bungs to business.
I don't think they've allowed massive inequality to develop. I mean, China was a much more unequal place in the 1920s and 1930s than it is today, surely.
I mean, definitely. I mean, it's more unequal than sort of Britain.
No, but it hasn't. Over time, it's not become more unequal.
I mean, it's definitely become more unequal since the 1980s. Yeah, I mean, it was very. It was equal and poor under Mao, and now it's very unequal and rich.
Sure, and that would be one critique that you'd get within China. But I don't think anybody would say it's more unequal now than it was at the start of the 20th century when you had British, Russian, Italian, German, French concessions inside the country.
But no one's really more unequal now than they were at the beginning. I mean, Britain and the United States are not more unequal than they were at the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, no, we've gone back to it, haven't we? I think that if you look at the Gini coefficient in the US, it's the highest it's been since, I think, the Great Depression.
Yeah, but I think China's probably still higher. Anyway, what I'm saying is that it's difficult to look at China and see confirmation of your own sort of ideological prejudices because they have taken such an interesting route. And partly, I haven't got pictures of it here, but we went to the Propaganda Museum in Shanghai where you've got like Deng's statements or Deng's sort of propaganda. So obviously Mao, very revolutionary. Deng's propaganda is all believe in science. Science, brilliant. Work very hard. Like it's all, obviously his most famous line is it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice. And so you can either look at China and sort of, this is a vision of the importance of communism, or you can look at China and say, this is a vision of the importance of pragmatism. And I think you probably do need a bit of both.
Yeah. His other great quote, of course, is, to be rich is glorious. Deng Xiaoping, he really had a way with these phrases. Of course, he was purged twice. He came back a third time. Never give up in politics, folks. When people say, I was thrown out of the Labour Party, I'm leaving politics, just think of Deng Xiaoping. Arguably the most important politician of the 21st century. Quite an achievement, given he died in the 1990s. But he laid the foundations for the success of China that we see today. I'd add one more thing, Michael. I think you're right. Just because it's a successful state, which is led by people who view themselves as Marxists, yes, it's at odds with the idea that trade unions and multi-party democracy works. It's a one-party state. I'd say one other thing as well. It's questionable whether its developmental model can be achieved by other places. So why is China, for instance, swallowing, I think something like 70% of lithium-ion batteries made in China. I think 75% of drones, UAVs, similar with electric vehicles, right? A global hub for things like 5G. It's just all these frontier technologies. It's just huge market share, right? Huge. Why is it able to do this? One reason is, of course, it's got loads of people. So it's got a huge domestic market. And once you've got a market of 1.4 billion, you have economies of scale. All of a sudden, the European Union is quite easy. Tons of talented people. I talked about this with you before. BYD, I think, has an R&D team of 100,000 people. Incredible. So that's true, of course. But also because they've basically socialized finance, the banks are broadly owned by the state or by local authorities, or partly owned. The way that credit is allocated to private firms, which also aren't private, they're often owned by the state or by workers. Huawei is a apparently owned by its own workers. The way that credit is allocated is very different to what we have here. So what you have is very, very low interest rate loans made by banks to a company like Cattle, which makes these lithium batteries, or BYD, or Huawei. And that ultra low rate of credit allows them to basically operate in industries which are huge scale, but ultra low margin and very competitive, which allows you to get a company like BYD, right? Or Cattle or Huawei. And Europe can't really build those kinds of companies for a bunch of reasons, because we haven't socialized finance and we haven't got the scale to operate with these razor thin margins. When you basically have socialized finance and a domestic market of 1.4 billion people, even if your unit profit on one BYD car is tiny, you're selling hundreds of millions of them over a 5-year period. Who cares? You're still going to make a ton of money. So it works. It's a real success story. The people overseeing it are absolutely inspired and driven by teachings and marks. Even the senior figures at places like Huawei, Ren Zhifeng, I think his name is, or BYD. These guys read Marx. They've read Marx. They're party cadres. You might think it's all for show. You're welcome to think that, but they are. They're both party members, those two CEOs. It's a separate question if you think we could replicate it here, in Britain, for instance. Maybe across the EU you could. Maybe you could. Maybe you could have a successful one-party state and a market of 450 million people in the European Union, 500 million people. But right now, I think it's quite unique. I mean, Vietnam, for me, is the more interesting case for a country like Britain or France or Germany. It's 90 million people, exporting powerhouse, but it does things in a really different way to China. But it's also much more exposed, right? If America wants to screw Vietnam tomorrow, it can.
I mean, it's also got
It can't do that to China.
much lower wages, right? So I don't know why we'd want to. I mean, is that a completely different stage of development?
Vietnam or China?
Vietnam.
But I'm saying I think
China does as well.
I think if you're a middle-income country in Central Europe, if you're hungry, I think Vietnam's quite an interesting country, because actually it's quite feasible that within 15, 20 years per capita, it's a richer country than you are. So, Vietnam has a domestic EV company. Vietnam has a company that can build EVs. It has businesses that could create COVID vaccines, right? As I understand it, Hungary doesn't have those kinds of firms. It's much smaller by population. I'm just giving you an example. A middle-income European country, I think Vietnam would be somewhere you think, okay, what can we learn from those guys? We always talk about China, but there are lots of countries out there which are really successful, doing really interesting things, which aren't China. Taiwan, how the hell did they build TSMC? A $1 trillion company. It's a small country. How do they do that? Vietnam, 90 million people, exporting powerhouse 30 years. Yes, it's cheap labor. Lots of countries have cheap labor. Yeah. They're not doing it.
No, but it's
Switzerland,
but
what are they getting right?
Who's got to learn the lesson? So China don't think they can export the model. Like, China thinks that we can do this because we're an exceptional people with brilliant state capacity. Obviously, we're not going to go to Ethiopia and say, do the Chinese thing, right? They think we're developed like this. Other people are going to have to develop in a different way. I suppose if what you are is a pragmatist and you're saying what works, for many countries, Bangladesh is going to be a better example than China. And I suppose that's why I think sort of like the lens
why would
of
Bangladesh be a better example? So what you're saying foreign direct investment, export-led growth, and they have massively increased their incomes without having the state capacity of a country like China. I think there are many countries in the world where if they try and do the Chinese model, they'll fail and it will be a disaster. I mean, there are many countries in the world who have tried to do industrial policy. Say a country.
That's tried to do that.
No, say a country, and why they should follow Bangladesh, not China. Say a country. I mean, everywhere's different, right? Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, I would say they should follow Norway, because of the immense mineral and energy wealth that country has, right? That would be the bedrock. Affluence in somewhere like Congo would be public ownership of resources.
But that's not the bedrock of affluence in Norway. It's not that oil. The bedrock of affluence in Norway is that they moved up the value chain, they got a very educated population, and they had sort of a successful mixed market economy.
The first thing a socialist regime in the DRC would do is that. That's what Lumumba wanted to do. I'm just giving you one example. Name a country. Don't talk in abstractions. Tell me a country that should follow Bangladesh and not China. Tell me a country.
I think probably Ethiopia would be better off following Bangladesh and China. I think they probably are following more Bangladesh and China, which is to say we want to do export-led growth. We want to get foreign direct investment in. We want to be very open to sort of international expertise, because we don't think we've got the capacity to do a China. Right?
I mean,
China has exceptional capacity, and you don't need so much state capacity to do a Bangladesh.
Do you think that wealthy countries then have more to learn from China than low or middle income countries? Like, does Britain or Germany have more to learn from the success of China in the last 15 years than Ethiopia?
Potentially. I mean, I think you can learn different things, right? I mean, I think in a way also China is just quite unique. There is sort of no other country that can be like China, and China doesn't want to make any other country like China. So I think because it is so sort of exceptional as a sort of...
Why is it exceptional?
Thousands-year-old civilization, 1.4 billion people, the oldest continuous state in the world.
Like, Iranians might disagree, Michael.
Well, I mean, the Chinese think that they're the oldest state in the world. I mean, they put it back 5,000 years. I think the Iranians probably put it back 3,000 years, do they? I mean, it's up for debate whether China does go 5,000 years back.
They take it back to what, the Zhong dynasty?
The Chinese?
Yeah. What's the first dynasty?
Well, it goes back to 5,000 years partly sort of mythically.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
Anyway.
I would say that I sort of disagree. I think wealthier countries, and that's really interesting. I think wealthier countries can learn more from China than poorer ones. I agree with you. I think the future of somewhere like Ethiopia is probably to say, you know what, ultimately, some production presently happening in China will happen here, some, and we'll be producing the Chinese EVs and the batteries, etc. Some of them, a bit like Japan did as it got older, right? And they'll go back to China or they'll be here for domestic consumption. But I think somewhere like Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Spain, and Spain is doing this. I think they should be looking at China and saying, actually, the relationship between politics and economic production should be fundamentally different. We should look at energy differently. Energy is the foundation upon which you build affluence. And I think China really got that with renewables, but also coal. But I think fundamentally, finance is the one, right? If you look at of all the bad decisions the West has made in the last 18 years, so many are in finance. QE, disaster. QE was a disaster. The banking bailout, parts of it probably weren't that clever. QE was the big one. So how were we allocating credit in the West? We were basically giving it to older asset owners. How are they allocating credit in China? They were building high-speed rail. And so for me, that's a really provocative challenge. How do you allocate resources? Which is what finance is ultimately. It's never explained like that by our media, but that's what it is. So I think Britain, the US, and this is part of what Dan Wong and what Ezra Klein talk about, right? I think they really, and it's an insightful observation, actually the US has a lot more to learn from China than a country like Ethiopia or Nigeria does.
No, I think that is probably true. I mean, especially when it comes to that kind of infrastructure. Anyway, I've got you a gift, very Falk-coded.
No.
Yes. It is a battery from the Chinese Communist Party Museum that says, "Believe in power."
Wow, Michael.
Which I thought was very Falk.
Wow. This is the nicest thing anybody's given me in a really long time. I'm not even going to take it out of the box.
You should take it out. It says "Believe in power" on the... Well, you're not going to be able to read it anyway, yeah.
Huh.
We should wrap up there.
I'm going to learn Pinyin just to read my charger.
Well, that's not in Pinyin. That's in... Pinyin is the Chinese in English characters.
So it's in... Oh my goodness.
It's in Chinese characters,
so it's in, what do they call them again, the letters?
I don't know what they call it. I mean, just traditional Chinese characters.
There's a letter... There's a... Wow, Michael!
Yeah. 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China.
Wow, you know me so well.
Yeah. Let's wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. And it's great to have you back from China.
Pleasure
I feel like you've invested in yourself. You've invested in the organization by going. And also, lucky China, You're saying they tried to pay me to go.
They tried to pay, I know.
They didn't need to.
I should have taken it.
I love it anyway.
Well, now I can heap praise on China without people telling me that I've sort of been bought. Let's wrap up there. Big shows for the rest of the week. Come back for a 2-hour show on Friday. And of course, Helena and Dalia will be here tomorrow with some updates on those local elections.
Oh, Michael, how are you voting? I have to ask.
I'm doing something interesting, which is, this might be controversial with our audience, is I'm going to vote Green where I live in Hackney, and I'm going to campaign for the Labour Party in Wandsworth because my friend Aiden Dickadem is head of housing there and builds social housing, and I really want them to stay in because the alternative would be the Conservatives. I hope that doesn't get him into trouble. You are allowed to campaign for a party when you're voting for a different one, aren't you? As long as you're not a member.
I presume so. I mean, maybe not in Keir Starmer's party, but I presume so. Look, they need all the help they can get right now.
Yeah, I think so. Let's wrap up there. Aaron Bastani, pleasure to be joined by you. Thank you for watching. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.